So every year, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, that's SAMHSA, which is a division of the Federal Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, conducts a survey of Americans regarding drug use. And the survey is known as the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, or else otherwise known as the NSDUH. And it takes years to process the enormous amounts of data collected. And, there have been some changes since, the current administration came in. But in general, they publish like an enormous compendium of, data, including all these graphs. And the most recent is from 2018. And more are included here on our drugs course site. The most recent models will be continually updated. But if you look at some of these, sort of the look at basically, over age groups, the reports of experimentation with drugs or use of drugs, it rises rather rapidly. Ages 16 to 17, 18 to 20 is pretty much the peak. Then 21 to 25 is where it's starting to drop down again. And ultimately it gets down, lower again, when you get into, late 20s, early 30s, 40s, etc. There are some deviations from that sort of typical curve where it goes up and then down. For example, alcohol tends to also go up significantly during adolescence, and then it tapers off far less, actually, than it does for some other drugs. But this is, basically, why would there be this extraordinary peak, during adolescence, during sort of late adolescence, young adulthood? Well, that is, it turns out, as we know, the period of the greatest elaboration and growth of areas of the brain that are involved in social decision making, right? Parts of the frontal lobe and their links and connections to areas in, the insular lobe, which is so important for that visceral felt sense of the body. So, this is a period where young people are taking all sorts of, significant risks, actually. And suffering the consequences, experiencing various consequences, and that helps to train and reconnect and redevelop, networks in this rapidly, developing portion of the brain during this period of adolescence to young adulthood. So this is when, yes, if you're going to tell somebody just say no, unless you actually make an effort and experience consequences viscerally, really feel what happened, you're not going to wire stuff up in exactly the same way. And it's important to actually, have cultures where we actually tell more, personal, moving, engaging, accurate, viscerally kind of moving stories that can actually provide some of that guidance system, for young people before they necessarily feel they have to take, significant risks with specific drugs. The other thing is, of course, the way that drugs are talked about or have been talked about, by certain elements of society, right, is that, they're just all bad. And, that's not true at all. I mean, every society uses drugs, and there is a significant difference between the use of drugs and a drug, what we now term a drug use disorder. It's actually kind of fascinating, the evolution of this terminology, because in the research community, people still always talk about drug addiction, right? And then, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Disorders, in the 4th edition, they talk about drug abuse and drug, dependence. Abuse, was bad, but dependence was worst. And then, now they've transitioned in the DSM-5 to a drug use disorder to remove some of the negative connotations in terms of counseling, and working with people, and treating a drug use disorder as a brain-based sort of disorder. But in the addiction literature and the research literature, it's still very much addiction, which I think is kind of interesting too. There's a lot of cultural factors that play on, both our understanding of drug actions and drug effects, and how those understandings sort of translate into treatment, counseling, and also public policy. And there's a number of resources here that you can also explore, and we'll be discussing that revolve around some of the other factors that play a significant role in what determines the scheduling of drugs, for example, under the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, what determines the legality of drugs, what determines the enforcement of laws around drugs as it relates to different individuals in our society, different communities. There's a huge influence of money and a huge influence of racism and white supremacy, basically in all of this that we'll be exploring. It's not only just the science and the understanding of what's going on, in the brain during adolescence and young adulthood that determines, our policy responses to this data, that's being collected by the federal government.